Good afternoon to everyone here in New York, and welcome to all of our guests from around the world. I am Steve Altman, Director of the DHL Initiative on Globalization here at NYU Stern's Center for the Future of Management. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this event and my honor to introduce our guest, Carolyn Freund, the Dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. In my view, Dean Freund has led some of the most interesting trade research that's been published recently, so I am thrilled that she accepted my invitation to join us here today. Prior to joining UC San Diego, Dean Freund was the Global Director of Trade, Investment, and Competitiveness at the World Bank. She has also held positions at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the International Monetary Fund, and the Federal Reserve Board. She holds a PhD in economics from Columbia University. The format of our event today is a fireside chat in which I'll begin by asking Dean Freund a series of questions about global value chains and how international trade is developing during the COVID-19 pandemic. Then, after we've drawn out some of the key themes from her research, we'll turn to questions from the audience. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the event using the Zoom Q&A function. And then I'll pose as many of your questions to Dean Freund as our time permits. In case of any technical problems, please also raise those in the Q&A function. Without further ado then, let's get started. Before we dig into trade trends and your research on global value chains, to help our audience to start to get to know you a little bit beyond the very impressive bio sketch that I just read, could you please start out by just telling us a little bit about what motivated you to study international trade?
Yeah, thank you. So growing up, I wanted to understand why countries were so different in terms of living standards. And I studied economics in college, and then I joined the Peace Corps and went to Ghana, which is a fabulous country if you haven't visited. And I really wanted to work on development. Then in graduate school, I came to the realization that really trade is the only, or maybe the best or fastest path to growth for small and poor countries. So it's impossible to produce everything that people want to consume. That means you need to import. You also need inputs and capital to produce. So again, you need to import. And then when you have a smaller population, it's hard to sell only to that population. If you sell to the whole world, it's a much bigger market. So you need your exports and a foreign market as well. And if you look at the countries that have done really well, whether it's Japan or Korea or Taiwan, or more recently China, Vietnam, they're all countries that have grown through kind of an export-led development path.
Thanks. I think it's before we even go beyond that, I think it's interesting how your answer mentioned imports as well as exports. Often in the context of trade and growth and economic development, there seems to be a focus on exports, but imports are also quite important.
Yeah, the old view used to be that you exported in order to import. Now it's kind of switched on its head with global value chains that you import in order to export as well, because you need all those parts and components that are produced elsewhere.
Great. And so you mentioned global value chains, to which I'd like to turn next. So to move into the main content of our conversation and to start to lay the groundwork for our audience, could you please explain briefly what global value chains are and what was behind their rapid rise before the 2008 global financial crisis?
So I guess when we initially think about trade, we think about trade in final goods. So, in the old example, cloth for wine or something like that, although I guess cloth isn't even necessarily a final good. When we think about global value chains, we're thinking about trade that crosses more than one border to get to its final place of consumption. So it could be the parts and components that come in to build a car, and then the car is exported and consumed in another market. So that trade would be part of a global value chain. And the thing about trade that's so different from GDP in terms of how we measure it is we measure it in gross terms. So when those parts and components come in, that counts as trade. And when they go out embodied in a car, their value is counted a second time. So trade can really surge as a result of this increase in crossing borders that we saw. But keep in mind, if it's going back and forth like that, if there's lots of barriers, it's getting hit all the time. So whether it's because of costs of shipping or delays at the port or tariffs, all of these things will make it really hard for trade to cross borders multiple times. But as those barriers started coming down, this type of value chain trade surged. And it's different because it's kind of like trade on steroids, because you can really leverage comparative advantage. So instead of just producing the good, you can produce more efficiently. You can focus on a specific part and component. When we were working on this for the World Development Report at the World Bank, there's one town in China that produces something like 80% of the world's buttons. So they can really, really, specialize in producing buttons. And it also tends to breed a little bit faster development as a result, because you have these returns to scale, you have learning by doing, and you can import technologies and know-how, because often it's driven by the big multinationals. So this is kind of what was going on before really the financial crisis is. So from the early 1990s until the financial crisis was the period of development of global value chains. And you had a lot of really big trade initiatives. Developing countries were reducing their tariffs unilaterally. The EU single market in goods, capital, service, and people developed. Eastern Europe opened up and eventually joined the EU. China opened up and joined the WTO. Well, you had the whole formation of the WTO itself, NAFTA, as well as the internet and communications technology, which made it easier for multinationals to manage this kind of more complex production across borders. So all these things, lower trade costs, communication costs, et cetera, made it efficient to produce this way, and really spurred the development of global value chains.
Great. So we had this big increase in trade, big increase in the extension of global value chains and trade in intermediate goods in the run-up to the 2008 global financial crisis. And you've talked about the policy enablers, the technology enablers. So let's then turn to kind of move forward in history to what was going on in the run-up to COVID-19. So after the 2008 global financial crisis, there was a slowdown in trade growth and in some of these global value chain measures. So what were the most important drivers of this slowdown between the global financial crisis and the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, one thing was, given trade costs at the time and given the existing, liberalization initiatives, et cetera, the formation of global value chains had to some extent largely run its course. So there was no new incentive to take this even further, because there wasn't a big trade initiative like a NAFTA or a China opening up. So you didn't have those. Any technological changes that were coming, it takes a long time for them to have effects. And I think there could be effects coming eventually from AI and blockchain and other new technologies, but those hadn't really materialized yet. And I think the internet had also sort of, with the extent of developing e-markets and that sort of thing, run its course. So there was nothing really new on the trade cost front to stimulate another round. You also didn't have major liberalizers. So India is a big country. Brazil's a big country. Those countries had started real serious liberalization initiatives. You might have had another round of shift, but that also didn't happen. Then as China was actually developing, they sort of reversed the trend. So instead of sourcing parts and components that were more advanced from other parts of Asia, they were moving up the value chain and beginning to source those domestically. So China was, to some extent, a huge trading country, and it was retreating a little bit from the global value chain model. And similarly, a big part of global value chains, which people don't realize as we measure them, is energy, because oil, fuels go in as parts or as inputs to a lot of goods, which then get exported. So they get measured as part of global value chains. And the US really went from being a major energy importer to an exporter. So that was another contributing factor. But perhaps the biggest was really slower growth. So as you know, when countries are growing fast, there's a lot of demand for imports, and that spurs trade growth, et cetera. I mean, there's kind of a virtuous circle, because trade also stimulates growth, and growth stimulates trade, et cetera. But we were kind of in this period of a little bit more stagnant growth. So trade also was growing more slowly in global value chains for that reason.
Interestingly, so we have a whole bunch of factors ranging from slower macroeconomic growth to what was going on in the policy environment, to the different major economies and what they were doing, as well as China's own growth and the development of its own internal value chains. So we've started to lay the groundwork here. We have the sense of, okay, we had this big increase in global value chain activity going up to the 2008 global financial crisis. We had a slowdown or a bit of a stagnation, and then came COVID-19 and the pandemic. And so let's turn then to trading global value chains during the pandemic. So while supply chain challenges have dominated the headlines, global trade in goods has well surpassed forecasts and grown to well above its pre-pandemic level, albeit with substantial variation across countries and products. About a year into the pandemic, you wrote that despite initial concerns, trade has held up relatively well. And last year, you tweeted, I always follow your tweets, that shortages are about excess demand, not international trade. So what's your current view on how international trade has performed during the pandemic? Can you elaborate on some of your earlier positions and perhaps bring us up to date on your sense of where we are in terms of trade during the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think trade has really been a saving grace. So despite all, and we'll get to reshoring and nearshoring and all this kind of stuff for resilience, but trade has really been a saving grace in terms of being able to provide us most efficiently with the things we need. So what happened when the pandemic hit? Initially, there was just a retreat of everything, and we saw trade slow, income slow, cuts in everything, because everybody was kind of staying home and not sure what to do. But then people realized, oh, I need a better computer. I need a new office chair. I'm not going to the gym. I need a Peloton. I'm not traveling. I want to remodel my kitchen. And all of that had the effect of shifting demand to very, very specific industries. And those industries hit capacity constraints. So there's only so many computers that can be pushed out at one point in time. So there was just a huge increase in demand. Sure, there was some issues with supply. Firms occasionally had to shut doors for periods because of worker shortages or COVID outbreaks. That happened domestically as well as internationally. Remember all the meat packaging in the US, for example. And then ports were strained. But as much as we hear about all those ships sitting outside LA and Long Beach, containers are up 16%. We're up 16% last year relative to their record high in 2018. So more goods were coming through the port than ever before. There were just lots and lots of goods waiting to come in. Imports and consumption were also up, 25%. One thing I did was I looked at products, imported products at the very disaggregated level where price and quantity are increasing. So you can imagine if it's demand surge, you should see quantities going up and prices going up as well. If it's a supply issue, we should see quantities pretty much constant or falling and prices going up. We're stuck, we can't produce more. And again, what I found was that 40% of imported goods saw prices and quantities rising. In contrast, the share of goods where prices were rising and quantity was flat or falling was only 20%. So it really seems to me I'm not saying supply isn't part of the problem, but it's really much more about demand. And I think, as we see inflation now, people are starting to recognize that more and more.
So it really underscores the importance of demand in all of what has happened. Maybe elaborating on that a little bit more before we go further into shifts in trade patterns. To what extent has this been related to shifts in consumer spending generally from services to goods? The sense that some of the things that people used to spend money on, all of these in-person services, going to restaurants, going to movies, and so on, it was something that people were doing less of during the pandemic, and that they then were spending more money on goods, and goods being traded more intensively than services. Is that a piece? We've been focusing mainly on trade in goods, but I'd like to see if we can we bring services into the picture in terms of consumption and trade?
Absolutely. So that was what I was getting at when I was saying you go from travel to remodeling your kitchen, you go from the gym membership to the Peloton, you go from restaurant to wanting to have buy different types of foods and wines at home. So absolutely, the shift in spending away from services towards goods was absolutely huge. And I think, it's one thing to watch on the way out of the pandemic as well. If it shifts slowly, maybe we won't have it because obviously it came on very suddenly. But if we do get lucky and it disappears more quickly than anticipated, I think the reverse could happen where we see a sudden shift back to services. And I think over the summer when there was a little bit of an abatement, and the vaccines were performing quite well, we certainly saw that here with restaurants having signs saying, please be patient with the server, we're understaffed and things like that. So a big part of it indeed was the shift to goods, but also the shift to very specific goods. And that was really hard to forecast. And then there were some mistakes. So the auto industry is the best example where they anticipated really low demand for an extended period and canceled orders of semiconductors only to see a surge later on as people preferred to drive than ride public transport. So things are, the economy's not is not good at adjusting to these kind of whiplash effects on demand that we've seen.
Perhaps trade has been an important enabler of these shifts. That I'd read one study. I was just quickly looking to see if I could find the source that pointed to the idea that in 2020 the mix of goods traded changed in 1 year as much as it normally does over a 5-year period. So not only was trade able to rebound swiftly, that was achieved even with a very large change in the mix of goods that were being traded.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I haven't seen that. I'd love to see that, but it doesn't surprise me. It kind of reminds me of the remark early on in the pandemic of, I think by someone at Microsoft, of we've seen, what was it, 3 years of technological adoption in the last 3 months. So it was really, really sudden changes in the way we work, the things we want, and how things are produced.
Yep, and e-commerce as well, with some relation to trade there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's turn then to the resilience themes. So there's been a lot of talk during the pandemic about boosting resilience via reshoring or nearshoring or diversification across supply locations. So different approaches that companies could potentially take to boost resilience. And you've looked at this topic both by watching how firms have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic itself, and you've also looked back at how natural disasters have reshaped global value chains in the past. So what does your research teach us about how COVID-19 might or might not reshape the geography of trade and global value chains?
Well, first, just to say that, we try to look at it based on things that have happened in the past, but of course, we haven't had a shock like this. So I think we can only learn so much. But I think we can also think about economics, and frankly, some of the discussion doesn't make a lot of economic sense to me. So if you think about resilience, in the same way that you want to minimize risk in finance, you can do that by diversifying. The problem for trade is it's very, very costly in most industries to do that, because you have all kinds, for autos, you have all kinds of safety certificates you have to get on every single part. Things are often customized to fit your specific product. You need to work with a reliable source. These relationships take a long time to develop. You don't just get 3 more of them overnight. So I could imagine dual sourcing, but when you talk to people in the industry, having multiple sources for every part is very difficult. So mapping your supply chain makes sense. Knowing it better, knowing how to adjust, and using new technologies, sure, but big change in diversification, I find unlikely. One thing we have seen is inventories. So that would be another way to build resilience, is to hold inventories. The problem with that is to start doing it in the middle of the crisis is just exacerbating the crisis. So a friend's brother is a contractor, and he's been hoarding appliances because otherwise you can't find them for remodeling people's kitchens again. But the problem with that is that's adding to the fact that others can't find those appliances when they need it. If everybody, just like we saw with toilet paper at the beginning of the pandemic, everybody can't hoard. So holding inventories might make sense if, like with oil, we stockpile when there's ample supply. But if you try to do it in the midst of the crisis, it actually feeds the problem. It's not a solution. And then reshoring or nearshoring, if the problem is about where a shock is going to hit, it goes back to the old adage of having all your eggs in one basket. You really, really don't want to do that. So it doesn't make sense to me why people are talking about reshoring, unless it's about somehow thinking that if it's close, it'll be safer. I think that's true if the problem was really about shipping, but we saw similar problems, within countries as between countries, and with closer countries. The border between Poland and Germany was harder to get across at some point in the pandemic than bringing goods in from China. So, I think it's not clear to me that that's how companies are thinking. When I've talked to them, one fellow told me we looked into moving to Canada or Mexico, but we're already heavily invested in machinery elsewhere, and we just don't know which way the wind is going to blow next. And so I think there's a lot to unpack there, but two important things I also want to bring out. One is no capital was destroyed in this crisis. So it's really different from a war or natural disaster where then you think, oh, I want to rebuild. Where do I rebuild that's safer? Here, all of your capital is intact. So why are you going to move that capital that you've already sunk, your investment into? And then the second is uncertainty. When you face a lot of uncertainty, and in this case, it's both about the end of the pandemic as well as policy shifts, the best thing to do is to wait. And I think that is also contributing to issues, is that if you think demand's only surging for a time, you don't really want to invest in a lot of, expanding capacity only to see that 5 years from now, you can't pay it off. So there's really a lot going on, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence that the pandemic in and of itself is going to lead to a huge readjustment. And you asked about research we had done. One thing we did with some colleagues at the World Bank is we looked at what happened following the tsunami in Japan, which took out a lot of production there. And led to shortages of parts and components, especially in the auto sector and electronics as well. And what we found is that there was a shift out of Japan. So for parts and components or final goods where importers were heavily dependent on Japan, overall, a country imported more than 15% of that particular product from Japan. They did tend to shift out of Japan, but they didn't diversify. So it wasn't the case that all of a sudden there were more suppliers. They just did what was happening anyway, which is go to lower cost suppliers that could produce at scale. So developing countries, and especially the big ones. And so I think in that case, the crisis pushed towards trends that were happening anyway. And I think the same would be said here, that still, you want the low cost supplier, you want the comparative advantage. You might be more careful about using technology to manage your supply chain, but unlikely to see lots of diversification. And in that case, also, there was no evidence of reshoring. So it moved away from Japan, but it didn't move to the home country, didn't move closer, distance didn't affect where it moved, really followed basic economic fundamentals.
So following the fundamentals, we're probably going to see maybe less change in the geography of trading low value chains than some people were talking about, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, when I recall one survey that we were looking at that showed April 2020, 83% of the respondents said that they were looking at nearshoring for their companies. The survey repeated a year later, and it was 23%. And that people had been looking at exactly the same kinds of alternatives that you were talking about, boosting inventory levels, digitizing to have better visibility through the supply chain, and so on. That maybe people looked first or talked first about geography, and then they realized some of the costs that you're talking about, and that a significant amount of diversification would be quite costly, and that maybe dual sourcing could make sense. But okay, so perhaps less change in geography than some people were anticipating at the beginning of the pandemic, perhaps some reinforcing of some of the trends that were going on beforehand. Let's turn next then to two longer run drivers of potential shifts in the trade environment, technology and geopolitics. Let's start with technology and then come back next to geopolitics. You've published some very interesting research on the relationship between 3D printing and trade growth. How would you suggest that our audience think about how new production technologies will affect the growth of international trade moving forward?
Yeah, so there's kind of this belief out there that automation or 3D printing is a substitute for international trade. And this is something that I looked into with respect, again, with colleagues from the bank with respect to 3D printing, and then some other colleagues when I was at the bank looked into automation more broadly. And it was interesting because both of our results were the same in the sense that we found automation actually leads to more trade. And why would that be the case? In the case of more general automation, I think the easiest way to think about is to go back to the auto industry, which is both the most automated industry and the one most heavily involved in supply chains, global supply chains. And the reason these things go together is once you automate part, and especially an expensive, heavy part, the price of the good falls, or the quality rises, there's more demand, people are buying more cars. So then there's this additional effect that there are certain parts that just can't be automated, that you'll continue to import from abroad, or certain resources you may not have locally, the rubber that goes into tires or something like that. And so you end up increasing imports around those. So there's a scale effect. So there's a bit of a substitution on part of it that maybe you don't import some components, but there's a scale effect because you need more of these other things. And that scale effect by far dominates. So the most automated industry is also the most value chain. With respect to 3D printing, what spurred this research was this concern at the bank that we were going to invest in infrastructure that might not be needed in the future because everybody's just 3D printing everything. You don't really need to trade. Kind of a crazy idea. And I just wasn't convinced that 3D printing was really going to have that effect. So we said, let's see if we can find some goods that are 3D printed. And it turns out the good that's most heavily 3D printed is hearing aids. And so we looked at what happened to trade in hearing aids as the technology was adopted. And what we found was that trade expanded really, really markedly. So again, there was much better quality, lower price, huge demand for this good, and trade took off. And it wasn't the case that you just scattered these 3D printers around the world and produced them at home, because it takes a significant amount of technology to scan the ear, transfer it, print, know how to work these printers, etc., so that it was really being done with returns to scale in very specific locations. So huge increase in trade, and as 3D printing was taking off. And 3D printing is mainly useful for these kind of customized goods. So it's not going to be a mass manufacturing kind of platform. And as a result, I think, might be used to fill when you run out of a certain input to help provide that product, or for really high-tech goods. And again, it can also mainly be used for small things, and those are easily transportable. So for all these reasons, I think it's much more likely to lead to, at least in the medium term, more trade rather than less trade.
Thanks. So some of the again, what people have been worried about might not come to pass. Well, let's turn then to another area where there are a lot of worries, which is geopolitics. So what about the geopolitical developments and their likely effects on trade moving forward? So do you see rising geopolitical tensions as a threat to future trade growth? And are geopolitical tensions likely to cause major shifts in the geography of world trade?
Yeah, so to me, that's really the million-dollar question. And I think one thing we've seen is China really can redirect trade on a dime. So, and I think a good example is when Australia called for a deeper investigation into the origins of COVID, and China responded by heavily discriminating against Australian imports. And the thing about Australia that's interesting is they produce a lot of goods that are very, very homogeneous. So things like coal or, raw agriculture type products that can easily shift. So if China's shifting away from Australia and still needs the goods, they're going to import them from a different country. But now whoever used to get their coal from that country that now goes to China needs coal. So Australia could just shift. So we did see this kind of geographic redistribution of trade in that case. And I think that's a warning for what we could see more of going forward. And I think it can be done rather quickly for those types of homogeneous, less complex goods. It's a lot more difficult in the value chains where, and I think one thing that's come out of this view towards trade and resilience and geography of trade is the dependence on semiconductors in the entire world from Taiwan. So we do have these places where I think there's a recognition we need to shift things around. How quickly this will happen, I'm not sure. And is there, some sort of agreement that can slow it, or some event that speeds it up? I don't know, but I think that policy really can redirect trade. Won't necessarily slow growth because you still have to find a new source, but it'll certainly, if you had a bipolar world, one group of countries around China and another around the US, Europe, Japan, et cetera, I think what you would see is slower overall growth because we wouldn't be producing things where it's most efficient, and innovation wouldn't diffuse as fast as it does in a more global environment.
Thanks. So I'd like to turn soon to our audience questions. So reminder to the audience to please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function, and we'll cover as many of them as we have time for. But before we turn to questions from the audience, I'd like to raise the topic of trade and environmental sustainability. You co-chair the Climate and Trade Task Force organized by the UCSD GPS Center for Commerce and Diplomacy. And you have said that climate action will not be possible without trade cooperation. So while the topic of trade and its environmental impacts is another enormous one, enough for another full hour session, could you please share some of what you see as the key points that we should be aware of as climate change becomes an increasingly central topic for trade policy?
Yeah, thanks. And I think this is an increasingly important topic. So I'm glad you brought it up. I think the first point I want to make is that trade is part of climate action itself, in that trade is all about producing things, producing goods where you have the abundant resources that are needed in production. And so when people think about buy local and they think that's somehow better for the environment, it's not if the resources being used to produce something locally are far, far more than the resources used to produce that good elsewhere. The resources used in transport are actually pretty small. And one example I like to give of this is Saudi Arabia has a dairy industry. So they have a bunch of cows that are in air-conditioned chambers. And that's, a really good example of an industry that's bad, and a heavily subsidized industry that's bad for the environment. It'll be better for them to import those goods from elsewhere than to produce them and even export them under the conditions where they're producing it. So I think the first point is just think about producing things where you have the resources needed, so you aren't also moving the resources around or using too much energy in production, because the energy in production can be a lot more than in transport. The second is that, economists would pretty much universally agree that pricing carbon is the best way to tackle climate change, because it pushes demand away from fuels and carbon intensive goods. It encourages research on renewables. It raises revenues. It lets markets work. Unlike subsidies where you have to pick who's going to get the subsidy and you might pick wrong. So the pricing carbon really lets the market work to get the best solution. A problem is regressivity, but in principle, with transfers, you can offset that, still raise revenues, and get a more efficient production base and consumption, and a more climate-friendly consumption basket as well. But where trade comes in is that if you are to have serious domestic environmental policies or price carbon, you need to do something at the border to avoid leakage. So otherwise, if it's really energy intensive to produce steel, I will simply import steel from some other country that might be emitting the carbon, as opposed to doing it domestically, unless that firm abroad is subject to the same tax as my own firm. So that's where you want to put in some sort of border adjustment. It's also necessary, and this is a point we make in that CCD report you mentioned, also necessary politically, because any domestic firm is going to want to be on a level playing field with foreign firms. And unless you put in that border adjustment, you're effectively giving preference to the polluting firm abroad over the more environmentally friendly domestic firm. So that's where trade comes in.
Thanks. So let's turn to some of our questions from the audience. And first we have some questions that are related to container shortages and freight rates. So in the Middle East, the question asks, in the Middle East, despite high demand for products, both for imports and for exports, we still have a shortage of equipment, particularly containers, due to the huge freight differential between China-US versus China-Middle East. Most of the ships and containers are being directed to Long Beach, as it's more lucrative to the shipping lines. When do you see when do you think the high freight rates might start to go back to normal? And what kind of global policies are involved in regulating potentially the surge in freight rates? And relatedly, also the questioner asks how much of the increase in freight rates is due to the shortage of containers versus shortage of product supply. So a related set of questions around container shipping rates and container shortages.
I don't think policy can do much in the sense that you, at any point in time, there's a certain number of containers. And so I'm not sure that price controls are going to do very much to help the allocation, especially if they weren't done somehow globally, which would be very difficult. What I would say, and I think this is the point that came to me as you were talking, was that it's really all about COVID. So the thing about shipping, and we've seen periods when we have gluts of ships and gluts of containers, and then periods when there are shortages, and the investment needed to expand shipping is very, very substantial, and it won't come online for some time. So if we continue to see high levels of trade, that will surely happen. But we have this huge uncertainty now that, as I said, is slowing down investment. Now, if COVID gets under control, I think what we will start to see is a slowdown in demand for goods, which will then feed back into more normalized shipping. And then finally, technology. So fortunately, the shipping lines, as well as many of the big multinationals, are starting to more carefully craft how they deliver goods around the globe. And so, for example, artificial intelligence can be used to better pack containers and more efficiently use them. How long this takes, I don't know. And then, finally, when you ask people in the industry, when are things going to ease? When are things going to ease? I've heard everything from 6 months to 2 years. So no one really knows. But certainly for the next crisis, I think we'll be better prepared with these types of technologies that are being developed.
Great. Let's turn to, there are a couple of questions regarding inflation. One of them asked about the effect of inflation, of high inflation now on the U.S.'s international trade. And another question asks about if the inflation is more driven by increased demand rather than supply shortages, what policy options would you suggest governments employ to address inflation? Will increasing interest rates alone solve the problem, or is that sufficient, or would something else be required? So I guess we probably want to keep the focus mainly on trade, but any comments you'd like to make relating trade to the current inflationary environment?
Well, I think the thing is that both are driven by the same force, which is this surge in demand. And so we're seeing higher priced imports, which themselves are feeding into inflation, but also domestic. I mean, the U.S. is still mainly a domestic economy, and even with the smaller demand for services, still mainly a service economy. So as long as demand is high, we're going to continue to see the inflation, but trade will also feed into that through the pricing channel. I guess where policy comes in is we can fix the bottlenecks at the ports and things like that, but that if it's really about demand, which I think there's a lot of evidence it is, that fixing supply bottlenecks isn't going to solve inflation. We're going to need to also see a slowdown in demand.
Let's turn next then to a question about trade and the distribution of medical products during the pandemic. So the question is, what grade do we give countries and their trade policies for the global distribution of medical products during the pandemic? How could we do better in a similar crisis in the future?
That's a great question. I think this is where inventories do make sense, although it's hard to predict what exactly you should be holding. So I think that's the problem with that argument. But certainly some of the personal protective equipment and some basic medical goods you might want to, just like we do for oil, especially if they're things that don't expire, hold inventories up. So I think that's one thing we can do for the next crisis. I think the other thing we've seen during this crisis that I'd like to say we could do differently, but unfortunately, I think politics will always get in the way, is that it would be better to share things more broadly. So vaccines are a perfect example where, in the US, boosters are readily available where many parts of the world haven't had the vaccine at all and have very low rates of vaccination. And, these variants can come from anywhere. So obviously it would be much better to find a way to have agreements and share these things more broadly. But for politicians, it's very hard not to put your local population first. And so that's where I say, I think there are agreements that could be made that would help the distribution. But I think it's unlikely politically that they would be. And then finally, more money could be spent to have a global solution. So the global financial crisis in many ways was not a severe crisis, yet we saw the G7 and multilateral institutions really step in to work together. I think that has been much more absent during this crisis and could have done more to help ensure a more equitable outcome.
Great. Let's turn then to a question on trade and environmental sustainability that came in from the audience. The question states, regarding your point on buying local being less environmentally efficient, is that more true in smaller countries? The logic makes sense in smaller countries, but in large countries like the US and China that do have the ability to produce goods/commodities domestically at fairly low cost, I would imagine that it's more environmentally friendly to buy local, is the point posed by the questioner. So is the point of buying local, the benefits or the cost of buying local, does it depend on the size of the country?
I mean, surely it depends on the size of the country, but it isn't a corner solution. So that's why larger countries have lower shares of trade overall. So they can produce exactly as the person said, they can produce more themselves of the things they need. But it doesn't mean that there aren't benefits for some goods from importing them. So just to give an example, the US can, in the winter, when most of the US, though not San Diego, is cold, can import fruits and vegetables from Latin America, South America, where it's warm, and instead of building greenhouses, which would be much less environmentally friendly to produce things like avocados. So yes, there's a relationship there, and small countries are far more dependent on trade, but it's still true that large countries sometimes do better by importing. And then finally, on that sustainability point, it's also about all the great environmentally friendly goods we're starting to produce. So, the battery operated cars and bicycles and solar panels and windmills. All these things are produced with value chains because different parts are most efficiently produced in different places. And making those goods cheaper means more people are buying them and we're saving energy.
Thanks. Well, I think we're probably down to time for just our last one, maybe two questions, perhaps only one. Let's take one that's very timely, but perhaps also very challenging. The question asks, can you please provide a brief overview of how the potential conflict in Ukraine may impact global trade, and what is in place to combat these threats?
Yeah, so that's not really an area of my expertise, but I think it, will hit in different ways. And one is certainly the energy market in Europe. Europe is very dependent on Russia for energy, and then they would have to find alternative sources if there were any kind of serious sanctions on Russia. There's also just the financial fallout. We see the U.S. stock market moving with the likelihood of a potential war, and then that consumer confidence that goes with that will, of course, also affect trade. And then, like the discussion around China-U.S. decoupling, think a further decoupling from Russia will, of course, and its satellites will have effects. Then there's a whole other issue around the various goods that would be needed for any kind of event that's happening there and all of that. But so it certainly will have an effect, but more probably through its effect on income and isolation of Russia than anything else.
Thanks. Do we have time for one more question? If we can, the last question that was posed from one of our students is about the example you mentioned of Australia. So given that Australia was able to redirect homogeneous exports like coal to other countries in response to China's trade discrimination against them, are homogeneous exports more robust to geopolitical developments than more specific products?
That's a great question. So one thing we've seen is that goods in value chains tend to be goods trade in value chain, and more complex goods tend to be more persistent. So meaning that you see those very individualized trade flows, even between companies using firm level data year after year. So there's less, on again, off again trade in complex. So certainly you can readjust homogeneous goods pretty quickly. It's why most most countries import it from the closest provider, because you might as well just minimize trade costs. That said, they also tend to be really volatile. So there's a different kind of risk that comes with them, which is these price swings due to demand surges, or they can also be hit by not so much oil, but certainly agricultural crops, by weather events and things like that.
Well, then, I'm afraid we have reached the end of our hour together. Carolyn, thank you again for joining us here at NYU Stern, and thank you for a fascinating conversation. Thank you also to everyone in our audience for joining us today. We would love to stay in touch and to welcome you back for future events. To stay up to date on everything we are doing here at the DHL Initiative on Globalization here at NYU Stern, please sign up for our newsletter at stern.nyu.edu/globalization. The next event at NYU Stern's Center for the Future of Management will be from our Strategic Management Initiative, which will be hosting Accenture Research Global Managing Director Francis Hinterman on March 2nd for a fireside chat about technology trends in 2022. For more information and to register, you could go to stern.nyu.edu/CFM. Again, thank you all very, very much and have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.